Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the WFA Global Marketer Week, which this year exceptionally takes place in a remote format. Across 3 time zones, hosted in 3 virtual hubs, New York, Amsterdam, and Singapore. Now, since we last saw each other at Global Marketer Week, the world has turned on its head. It's been more than a year now. Who would have predicted that this damn virus would still be with us in April 2021? But there's hope. We're being told that the lifting of the lockdowns is now just a question of time. Challenging times, yes, but challenging times can also have their upside. From WFA's perspective, it's helped us to bring together our best ever speaker lineup, and we've managed to attract a record number of marketers from literally all around the world. At the latest count, over 2,500 participants from over 70 countries. Yes, you heard me well, over 70 countries. My name is Stefan Leuke. I'm the Chief Executive of the World Federation of Advertisers, and I will be moderating the conference for the next 3 days. Now, I realize that some of you may not be that familiar with WFA, so here's a quick intro. WFA is the only global organization bringing together client-side marketeers. We have in our membership 130 of the world's biggest and most famous brands, from Red Bull to Airbnb, from Coca-Cola to Procter & Gamble and Unilever, and many more. We also have in our membership 60 national advertiser associations in the 60 largest ad markets: US, China, Russia, Japan, Australia, Brazil, UK, France, and many more. Collectively, we represent a large chunk of total ad spend, approximately 90%. Now, despite our event being in a remote format, we want to make these 3 days interactive, and we'll be running polls and we'll be hosting many live sessions with live interaction with speakers. So please check out the poll, which is on your right-hand side of the screen, to make sure that you're ready when we run the first poll of the day in a couple of minutes. Now, the last 12 months have been testing for many of us, personally and professionally. But amid all the doom and gloom, we've also seen some really positive developments. The pandemic has forced our industry to finally confront some of the big issues it has been ignoring for way too long. It has been a powerful accelerator for the WFA's better marketing agenda, which is all about better aligning marketers with the aspirations of a society that is changing rapidly. I'd like to highlight a few really important initiatives we've taken over the last 12 months. Let me start with diversity and inclusion. The Black Lives Matter movement has led to an introspection with respect to diversity and inclusion like we've never seen before. And that's very good news. It was the catalyst for the launch of our Diversity and Inclusion Task Force that is led by our 2 wonderful ambassadors, Belinda Smith from M6 and Jerry Dakin from JSK. The group brings together some fantastic personalities from all across the ad industry that are determined to bring about real change, with some very concrete deliverables. And one of the first outputs of that group is a guide that provides practical guidance to brands and their agencies to avoid unconscious bias in the creative process. Addressing diversity and inclusion in our industry is a moral imperative. But let me be very clear. It is also very candidly in our self-interest. It will determine in no small measure our license to operate in the future. The theme of diversity and inclusion will cut across our entire conference program as a common thread. We didn't want to silo it off into one session. We expect every speaker to touch upon it. Another example of positive change is the industry's fight against the proliferation of hate speech. And we've seen a lot of that over the last 12 months. It has been turbocharged by the WFA-led Global Alliance for Responsible Media, also known as GARM. And it put the question of harmful content and hate speech onto the C-suite agenda. It will be one of the main themes of our program today. Now, the pandemic has also led to a radical change in digital media consumption and e-commerce. It has made the case for our WFA cross-media measurement blueprint, which we published last September, even more compelling. It is high time to shake up legacy measurement systems and create future-proof, holistic systems. Measurement has been a core focus for WFA since we were founded almost 70 years ago. But this has become an ever-increasing priority for our members and all brand owners across categories and geographies. The focus is now on the two exciting pilot projects, one in the US, led by the ANA, and one in the UK called Project Origin, led by ISBA. Now, we're excited to see the advertiser-led vision of measurement take shape, and we're committed to use the learnings to support a global rollout. And finally, there's the question of climate change and sustainability. The pandemic has been a wake-up call for many of us. It has exposed how vulnerable our societies are to changes in our environment and brought home the urgency of rising to the challenge of climate change. COP26 will take place in November in Glasgow this year, in less than 7 months. That's the UN summit where nations will take stock of their efforts to contain climate change. And the likely conclusion will be that they're falling short of what is needed, well short. There will be a huge amount of pressure on all parts of the industry, including the marketing industry, to join that global effort. We're convinced that marketing can be a powerful accelerator of a transition to a more sustainable society. And we're determined to support brand marketers step up to that challenge, to make marketing part of the solution. More about this in our program tomorrow. You can see our agenda via the schedule button at the top of your screen, and here's a quick overview of the program for the next 3 days. Today, we're focusing on what we've called better society. We're going to look at how brands can be a force for good and a force for growth. And we'll do it virtually from New York with most of our keynote speakers based out of the US. Tomorrow, we're going to explore the challenges around sustainability and climate change, which have moved to the top of the CMO agenda within 12 months, with some truly inspiring case studies. And we'll be doing this out of Amsterdam virtually, of course. And on Thursday, we'll focus on growth, and not any kind of growth. We call it principle-driven growth, with some fascinating case studies from Asia, out of our virtual hub in Singapore. Now, before we jump into the program, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. We want to thank each of them for their continuous support. Our platinum sponsor, RTL AdConnect, our premier sponsors, Double Verify and Ubiquity, and all the other sponsors who you'll find in the partner section at the top of your screen. Please take the time to check them out. This being said, I'd like now to turn to you. And here's our first poll. We'd love to hear from you, your view on a question that will be central to today's presenters. And here it is. Do you feel the pandemic will ultimately help marketing to improve as an industry? Okay, so if you could please respond to that question. And as we receive those responses, let me emphasize that you can put your questions in the Q&A widget, and please feel free to comment also in the chat function. So give ourselves 10 more seconds to see what the feeling is in the industry. Can the pandemic be helping marketing to improve? We're getting the results in, and yes, so we have an optimistic majority among our participants today, and that is a very good way to start the day. And let's just jump into the program right now with Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, also known as ADL, the oldest and most prominent anti-hate organization in the world. He's an innovative leader who's held big roles, both in the public and private sector. In his previous lives, he was, among other things, a startup entrepreneur. He held the role of Vice President Global Consumer Products at Starbucks, and he also served as Special Assistant to President Obama in the White House. Jonathan will share his perspective on the fight against hate in the US and globally. He will then be joined by Raja Rajamannar, the WFA President and Chief Marketing Officer of Mastercard, to discuss more specifically brand marketers' responsibilities in the fight against hate and harmful content. Please join me and welcome Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to have an opportunity to speak with all of you today from the WFA, and I look forward to answering your questions after my prepared remarks. The ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the world. We've been tracking extremist movements and the spread of hatred literally for more than 100 years. We've seen all kinds of hateful movements over the decades, but we've never seen a moment like this. Not just when tensions seem to be at an all-time high in the US and around the world, but a moment when we've seen white supremacist ideologies, conspiracy theories, racism and anti-Semitism, disinformation and extremism, all moving from the margins into the mainstream. In a moment, I'm going to talk to you directly about the important role that I think the world's leading corporations, businesses, and advertisers can play in helping to push back against this tide of rising hate that threatens all of society. But before I do that, I'd like to step back and look at some of the broader trends that we are seeing unfold today. Truly, 2020 and even into early 2021, it's been a time like no other. Aside from the many challenges we faced as a result of the global pandemic, we've witnessed another sharp escalation in hatred and extremism, rising hate crimes, and increasing inequities, particularly across American society. We saw one of the most divisive elections in America's history last year, complicated not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also by the spread of rampant disinformation on social media, as well as false allegations of voter fraud, which culminated with the violent and deadly insurrection at the US Capitol this past January, the most predictable terror attack in American history, because it literally was planned and promoted out in the open on social media. We saw the horrifying murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the recent senseless killings of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo spur an overdue reckoning on issues of racial justice here in America. Literally, the Black Lives Movement has galvanized scores of millions of people across these 50 states and even around the world. It's been described as the largest social movement in American history. We've seen Asian Americans blamed, scapegoated, assaulted, and murdered in record numbers in recent months, thanks in part to the anti-Chinese and anti-Asian rhetoric spouted by some of the highest leaders in the land in America, and then parroted by pundits on cable news and again spread across social media. And then, of course, we've seen anti-Semitism. Perhaps it's no surprise that anti-Jewish invective has metastasized and multiplied in this new media environment. You know, scholars call it the oldest hatred, but it might better be described as the deadliest virus because it seemingly has no cure, and anti-Semitism has affected so many societies throughout history. And today it spreads from Facebook to Twitter, from YouTube to Zoom, from TikTok to Clubhouse. We've seen a torrent of Holocaust denialism, a tsunami of depraved lies about the Jewish people or the Jewish state. The anti-Semitism seems to come from both sides of the spectrum and literally from all corners of the world. Indeed, we've seen some of the largest and most successful social media companies on the planet continue to fall far short of their responsibilities as their lax management has created loopholes and their algorithms amplified not only anti-Semitism, but the rampant spread of so much prejudice and poison. So these are some of the trends that we've been monitoring here at ADL over the past 15 months. Now, stepping back again, for more than a century, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. As part of that work, we've assembled the best team in the world, individuals with unmatched expertise who relentlessly investigate extremist threats and evil that has intensified and expanded in recent years with devastating consequences. And during my tenure as CEO, we've broadened the scope of our work to also examine how those threats are spreading in a digital world and how extremists are using social media and other platforms to spread propaganda, disinformation, and hate. ADL's Center for Technology and Society in Silicon Valley is working with the leading companies, developing new tools, and sharing best practices to identify and expose those who use their platforms for harm and hold the companies accountable when they fail to place people over profits. Many of you are familiar with our biggest initiative on that front, the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. It started last summer after the murder of George Floyd, that we saw promoted on Facebook in sickening ways. And so our message to the company was clear. It was no longer acceptable to house hatred and extremism on their platform, and no longer acceptable to allow such extremist garbage to be subsidized by your advertising dollars. And thanks to the coalition that we put together, leading civil rights organizations, leading advocacy groups, 1,200 of the largest businesses and brands in the world, including many of you, a number of public figures, including Hollywood celebrities and other individuals, as well as regulators. Together, we were able to finally force Facebook to acknowledge the full extent of the problem. And as a result of our campaign, some of the most iconic brands of the world, again, including many of you, pulled ad dollars, millions and millions of ad dollars from the platform. And so the success of the campaign was unmistakable. We forced an unprecedented public examination of Facebook's deep harms to marginalized communities and to the health of our democracy. For the first time in the history of the platform, it introduced a series of new policies, taking down our militia groups, removing racist content, classifying Holocaust denialism as anti-Semitism, eliminating QAnon content, and so much more. It sent a clear and direct message to Facebook's leadership. Their actions don't align with the common values of our society, and that we were no longer willing to tolerate their inaction and profiting from hate. Here's a powerful video we issued during the campaign to educate the public about our concern.
Dear Mark, there are things we like about Facebook. Birthdays, staying in touch, sharing our lives with our friends. But there's a more sinister side of Facebook, the one that spreads hate, racism, misinformation, and gives extremists a way to communicate and coordinate. Don't get us wrong, legitimate revenue from legitimate content is one thing. But allowing these white supremacists, threatening racists, xenophobic and anti-Semitic extremists, and nationalist militias to use Facebook to spread their content is destructive. And yet, you are still giving these hate groups the biggest platform they've ever had. Your business model rewards division. Are you finally going to listen to us, Mark? Are you willing to stop profiting from hate? Can we trust you at all? We have demands to make Facebook better and safer for everyone. It's time to make it a reality. Demand change. StopHateForProfit.org.
Stop Hate for Profit did more than just send a clear message to Mark Zuckerberg and other Facebook executives. Other companies heard our call and started to step up as well. During our campaign, Twitter took strong action against the promoters of dangerous conspiracy theories on their platform. Reddit took action by updating its content policies to better address hate and removed more than 2,000 hate-filled subreddits. YouTube likewise took overdue action against white supremacists who were abusing their platform, as did TikTok, as did Twitch, and others. Does this progress mean that our work is done? Far from it. There's still a number of changes we want to see on Facebook and these other companies. And we still need you, the major advertisers, to keep pressure on those platforms to ensure that they're continuing on the path of reform. And this is crucial because none of you want your brands to be associated with extremism or hate. That's why the marketing community has a vested interest in holding the platforms to account. As CMOs, you have the ability to ask the right questions on the platforms that you choose to advertise on, and to press their leadership on whether they're adequately following through on the public's demands to rid their systems of such poison. Now, I admire and deeply respect the work of the WFA's Global Alliance for Responsible Media, and particularly the work that GARM has done in providing a shared framework for social media companies to step up their game. This is admirable and important, and I hope it continues, but there's still so much that needs to be done. Earlier this year, ADL released our annual online hate and harassment survey. We found that 41% of Americans have been exposed to online harassment. 41%. And the poll found that of those adults who were harassed, where did it happen? The most? Far and away on Facebook, followed by the others. Now, before I pause for Q&A, let me just share another vivid example of how hate speech and white supremacy is moving from the fringe into the forefront of our society. Just 2 weeks ago, on his Fox News program, Tucker Carlson, the most highly rated talk show host on primetime cable news, endorsed the white supremacist, quote, great replacement theory. If you haven't heard of it, I'll share that it's a virulently racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that holds that a secret group of Jewish people are plotting to flood the United States with non-whites and immigrants in order to commit white genocide. It originated in Europe and France in particular decades ago, but it echoes long-standing staples of white supremacist ideology that have festered here in this country for well over a century. And yet, in front of the largest primetime audience in America, Mr. Carlson asserted that this, quote, flood of immigrants was happening because the Democratic Party intentionally was engineering a huge influx of immigration to bolster its voter base. Now, I don't care how you politically affiliate, and I don't think I need to tell you how ugly this rhetoric is, especially when it's repeated by someone with millions of viewers across the country. But it's also dangerous, literally a prompt to violence. Replacement theory led to the chants of Jews will not replace us that echoed through Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, the night before neo-Nazis mowed down and murdered Heather Heyer. Extremists invoked replacement theory when they massacred 11 Jews who were praying in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2018, as well as 51 Muslim worshippers who were gunned down in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. Or later that year, 22 Latinos who were also gunned down in the parking lot of a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. So make no mistake, the grace replacement theory is a deeply dangerous message that has incited violence. Now, immediately after we saw this segment, we reached out to the network with a simple appeal. It's time for Carlson to go. And that isn't cancel culture. That's conscious management. The response we received back from Fox Chairman Lachlan Murdoch could be summarized as follows. While we respect you and the ADL, Tucker didn't really mean it. He was talking about voting rights, not embracing a white supremacist trope. But I can assure you, Carlson's message wasn't lost on those white supremacists and bigots who are now applauding him for embracing their talking points. Why do I share this story in a conversation about social media? It's an example of how hatred is being mainstreamed in America in 2021. And it's another example of where, as advertisers, you have a potentially pivotal role to play. Through your marketing muscle, you have a distinct and powerful voice in what information networks like Fox or Facebook will or will not allow on their platforms. You can hold them accountable like few other actors in society because your dollars literally are the fuel that enables their entire business model. And don't think for a second that their size somehow insulates them. You see, it's not just about the revenue pressure that you can apply. It's the reputational pressure that you can bring to bear. And so we need your help in sending a message when our media networks fail us and allow hatred to spread. And when I say we need help, I mean it. Look around you. Politics are polarized today. Congress is gridlocked. The courts move at an excruciating pace. Special interests seem to dominate think tanks and public debates. In this moment, CEOs have stepped forward and filled the leadership vacuum in our society in important ways. Take the recent pushback against laws here in Georgia that would restrict people's right to vote, or the leadership on climate shown by so many corporations. Now, I'm not taking regulators off the hook. Ultimately, public policy, public problems demand policy solutions and systemic change. But you indisputably have a kind of power. And if you'll forgive the cliche, with great power comes great responsibility. And as you think about your responsibility, I would submit that the fight against hate is the fight of our time. The future of democracy, the nature of our societies, it hangs in the balance. And as an industry, you are uniquely positioned to push these networks whether they are mass media or social media, to do their utmost to ensure that hatred and conspiracies are not amplified. Yes, the First Amendment does allow for people to espouse fringe theories, but we together need to keep those fringe theories out on the fringe where they belong. So I'll close with a challenge to you. Commit to this fight. Choose a side. Choose to pause or even pull your ads, not just from problematic programs, but altogether from networks that don't respect all people or that repeat baseless conspiracies that endanger all of us. Choose to use your conversations with the management of these companies to push them to do more, and use your own public platforms to demand the same. Choose one of the unfulfilled Stop Hate for Profit demands. You can find it at our website, stophateforprofit.org, and directly demand that Facebook in particular, the largest social media service on the planet, continue down the path of real change. Let me close by noting that I appreciate that many of your CEOs and many of you have made public statements and internal commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Making good on those commitments means doing it all the time, not just in how you hire or who you promote, but in what values you embed across your value chains. And I know that you feel accountable to your shareholders, to your customers, to your employees, and to your children. And so, right here, right now, this is your opportunity. Choose a side. Fight hate for good. Thank you.
So, Jonathan, wow, that was an absolutely powerful, compelling, and quite a hard wake-up call if people are still not awake to these realities, right? Want to really applaud you, how you have articulated it, and it's nothing short of stunning. One point I would start off with is when we formed GARM, as you rightly know, for the last few months, there has been intense amount of activity. For the first time, there have been all sides of the ecosystem coming to the table, whether it is the social media platforms or it is the ad tech companies. And of course, we serve the brands primarily, all working in tandem to first even define and agree things like what is hate speech, right? We started from there, and I think we have got, so these are very significant steps that are slowly moving in the right direction. There is a lot that we need to still accomplish, but at least there is movement in the right direction. And I think they say in inertia, starting from 0 and going to 1 is more difficult than going from 1 to 2 or 3 or 4. So hopefully this will get speeded up. But I just wanted to pick your thoughts in terms of when you look at the connections between hate, media, not just social media, and you have today highlighted the television media as well. So if you look at all the media and you look at the technologies that are there, how are they sort of interacting or intersecting that would challenge the business practices today? And what has been ADL's learning so far on this journey?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And I would only say first that I think the work that GARM is doing is critically important. I think having the social media services at the table with the big brands is critical. I mean, they need to be partners in this. And again, I think different companies behave differently. They're not all uniform. So I really want to applaud what you guys are getting done. I think it really matters. That being said, it's crucial to hold them continuously accountable, to force them to make public commitments on what they'll get done, and then to honor those commitments, and to do so with transparency so we can fully understand the extent of the problem. If your ads show up alongside hateful content, that wasn't what you were paying for. You should be able to audit that and get refunded for those ads. I mean, it's simply wrong. And if they won't, again, deliver that basic service to you like every other media platform would do, you should push them to pull your dollars. Because again, I think there's a contract here, a social contract, not just a legal contract, that you should force them to abide by. Now, that being said, I think what's complicated in this moment, and it speaks to your question, is we've seen how media and technology come together to condition the environment and to essentially make a kind of extremism acceptable, to normalize hate, if you will, in ways we've never seen before. Some of this, I think, is the result of the algorithmic amplification of content in ways that are often invisible to the user, right? Certain stories or certain perspectives and biases are reinforced by the algorithms because a user is found when they're clicking on from their phone or their laptop to more likely to click through. So we have this world in which people are, again, trapped in their own filter bubbles, entirely invisible to them. And when that happens, when you can, again, change someone's worldview without them even realizing, that can condition individuals, communities, countries for massive division and real damage. So that is a critical piece of this puzzle that needs to be addressed. And that convergence is something we're working hard on at ADL. So not only relentlessly monitoring what each of the platforms are doing, but building coalitions like Stop Hate for Profit and working in cooperation with companies. You see, I think this is a really important point. This isn't just an advertiser problem or an issue for civil rights organizations. This is everyone's issue. And by working together, our collective strength and will is what I think is crucial to actually turn the tide on this issue once and for all.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And in fact, to your last point, that it is not just the problem of one part of the ecosystem, but everyone in the ecosystem need to have that social commitment, right? And it is for the collective good that we have to do. So I completely get that and totally support that. But as an ecosystem, how does it sort of reform? How does it get reformed? Now, when I look at, for example, the intentions of everyone in the ecosystem are exactly the same. Nobody wants to do anything by design to make hate speech prevalent, right? The brands don't want to show up next to a hate speech ad, for example. And I highly doubt if any of the platforms would want to, promote hate. But the key thing is, there is a reform that is needed because status quo is clearly not acceptable. How do we really, bring about, what kind of a reform do we need to bring about? And also there are some technological complexities which are involved, which many people might not even have an understanding. The key thing is, how do we really, address those kind of areas? What kind of questions and, thoughts should experts be posing to themselves and to their partners in the ecosystem?
Well, I mean, you're asking, if I might, the $64,000 question, right? This is the big question of our time, which is, how are we actually going to affect this change? But I would say, to a point that you made in your question, in your remarks, that I think it's true that no company wants to be responsible for abuse, for excusing extremism, right? For spreading stereotypes. No company wants that. But the reality is that hate speech is hard. It's not easy. And most of these social media platforms in particular were built with an intention to scale as fast as they could, and without consideration of issues like moderation, issues like user safety, issues like privacy. And in fact, the business models of many of these companies is inimical to things like protecting consumer privacy, because they literally, we know, they rely on user data to repackage and sell, often to the advertising industry. So there's a bit of a disconnect here. Again, I think brands across the board, companies, I think I'm going to guess, Raj, all of your members, again, have made public commitments and made private statements to their employees about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the challenge is that some of these advertising platforms utterly undermine those commitments. Because again, these different services, right, don't serve diversity. They don't enable equity. They don't amplify inclusion. In fact, they work to compromise those values. So this will be hard. It's going to force a Facebook, for example, to really look at its business model and to really consider, how do they need to rework it? Now, that might sound like anathema to you, right? But think back to a company like J&J in the 1980s, when Johnson & Johnson had a scare with Tylenol in the 1980s, where several individuals who used Tylenol in the Chicago, Illinois area were killed, if you recall, because the product had been tampered with. Johnson & Johnson literally pulled every bottle of Tylenol off every shelf in America and completely reformulated the packaging. At great expense, by the way. But they did it because they needed to keep their users safe. Or take, for example, a company like Odwalla from the juice industry that eventually was acquired by Coca-Cola. When Odwalla had an issue in the 90s with E. coli bacteria, like a toddler died after drinking one bottle of Odwalla because it had E. coli. The company literally pulled every Odwalla product off every shelf in the United States and then re-envisioned the entire production process to solve the problem, again, at great expense. So we talk about what does a company like Facebook need to do? How do we deal with this? Facebook earned $86 billion in revenue last year. They earned $24 billion in profit. It has 3.5 billion users. It is far bigger than any company in the history of business, and it's the most sophisticated advertising platform, literally, like in the annals of capitalism. So I would say to you, will it be hard for them to deal with this? Yes. And it might be expensive. But in the same way that pharma companies or CPG businesses have absorbed those expenses, so too is it long overdue for a company like Facebook to simply do the same. And if that means hiring legions of customer service representatives to analyze content, so be it. And if that means being more transparent about what happens on the platform and actually revealing all the hate content so scholars and analysts and experts at places like ADL can understand it, so be it. These things must happen, Raja. I think, again, the fate of our society hangs in the balance. If we don't solve these problems now, they will only worsen. So it's up to us to get it done.
Yeah, I think it's almost at one sense a little sad that in this day and age, we have to tell ourselves and everyone that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important. It should be so, and because we are in the 21st century, and in this day and age, we are saying it's really sad. But the other point is, there is one thing which is industry, the code of conduct, how we conduct ourselves, whether it is the brands or the social media platforms, main media, the mainstream media like the televisions and the newspapers, etc., and the ad tech companies. That one is one part of it, self-regulation, getting together and trying to do like what sort of Garm is doing it. The other part of it is you got regulation, which is the government steps in many times to say, hey, this is how you guys have to conduct yourself because you're not doing adequately by yourselves. And the third part of it is activism. So where somebody has to stimulate, catalyze, and say, hey, this process has to happen, show the torchlight on those issues that really matter, and then bring about a sense of urgency. How do you think this interaction is going to be or should be in the coming few months and years as we try to solve this very difficult problem and persistent problem, I would say?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, I think, again, if we look back at the history of capitalism, particularly in the United States, typically it was activists who mobilized and pushed for things like consumer safety laws, right? Or better, fairer labor standards. And sometimes those activists have been from specific demographic or like gender communities. Sometimes they have been spawned by consumer movements. The fair trade industry would be a good example of this, that really all sprung up because consumers and activists worked together to push for better labor practices in the harvesting of everything from coffee to other kind of agricultural products and the labor standards that were associated with them. So I think the role that ADL is playing and that others are playing as activists trying to catalyze the change is not unique. I also think that regulators getting involved is not unique at all. I mean, look, I've spent most of my life in building businesses. I used to run a media company myself. I used to, again, ask companies like Mastercard to advertise with us. So I fully appreciate, I think, both sides of this solution. And having been in business and worked in the White House, I'm someone who is, I think, oriented towards self-regulation. because I believe that companies often want to do the right thing and can build the codes of conduct, as you alluded to. But here we simply have a case where again and again and again, self-regulation has seemed inadequate to arrest the abuse, which is why I think ultimately policy will need to play a role. And so regulators will engage. But that takes a long time. So between the moment when activists organize and start to pressure for change and when policy comes into play, that's where the third factor, as you identified it, businesses have a role. And that's what the thing I believe is unique in this moment. Again, maybe it's driven by employees or consumers or other stakeholders. As you mentioned, we shouldn't have to talk about DEI as a priority. It should just be there. But frankly, I think, again, events of the past 12 to 15 months have only made us clarified for us why this matters more than ever. And so as companies try to be true to an ethos of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so they need to make sure that that ethos isn't compartmentalized just in how they hire or promote, but it's also how they source, how they produce, and how they market their goods and services. So again, if you are being public about DEI, don't be surprised if the public holds you accountable and expects you to be true to this ethos across your entire value chain. So companies, I think, right now are better positioned than ever to make this a priority and push, again, mass media and social media to do better for the sake of all of us.
Got it. Jonathan, that was fantastic. Thank you very, very, very much. And, again, I'm really pleased with the kind of effort the WFA is leading through GARM. And like I said, it's something which is not that instantaneous or easy to solve, but it requires a resolve. It requires everyone to come to the table. And it requires shepherding all different points of view to make sure that everyone appreciates that A, that there is a problem, and B, that we need to do something about it, and C, to commit to solving it. So I see that movement happening very positively from all parts of the ecosystem, which was, I would not say this is the case maybe 2 years back. So therefore, I'm optimistic. But optimism should not stop there. I think it has to go to the next stages and then evolve. But we'll keep the dialogue on. And again, thank you so very much for coming and speaking with us here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
WFA Global Marketer. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Please take care. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Raja. Some powerful messages and a fascinating discussion. We're now going for a small break. Join us in the next session starting in 5 minutes. We'll hear from the lead CMO of Mars, Jane Wakely, and we'll also hear a very exciting announcement by the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. So see you in 5 minutes.